So I just finished country club climb. Might be a little wheezy still, but another conversation on the bike. I know the audio is a little, well, it suffers a little because of this, but I think it's manageable enough to watch and listen to. So I'm gonna keep doing it whenever I feel like it. The Summer of George. If you are a fan of Seinfeld, you may already know this reference, but basically, I've been chasing the Summer of George ever since I moved to Lethbridge, basically. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. Some just being in relationships that maybe I wasn't happy in, and I wasn't happy with myself outside of the relationship, or when I was single, or whatever. And just putting this Summer of George on a pedestal and having this fantasy of, you know, living the single life, doing what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, beholden to nobody, zero responsibilities. And some of that, I guess the cauldron of ingredients that got created there was moving to Lethbridge, because that, I mean, I moved for teaching opportunities. I moved and was on the sub list, and there you go, you got summers off if you have enough financial stability to make it work. Or if you're like me and you don't have enough financial stability to make it work, but you do it anyway and you struggle. No, there's some years that I have worked in summer for sure, since subbing and teaching. Yeah, that's happened. I needed to. But anyway, because that's an option that wasn't really there before in my life, and it wasn't just like preloaded into whatever job I had, like, hey, we don't work in the summer, so you gotta find something else. It just wasn't anything I was doing. And again, timing of just like moving, being in a new area, getting the studio space, not being super content in my romantic relationships, and also just not being super content with myself sometimes. But along with that, in a mix of ingredients, was that since moving here, I think I've done so much more work on myself. And so it becomes this weird mix of like the Summer of George, chasing this fantasy, but also feeling like you deserve it. It's just like, imagine what you could do. Like, in a positive way, sometimes it swings back and forth. And this is why I think it's better to lay this fantasy to rest anyway, which is what I've decided to do, and thus this conversation happening. Because sometimes it was a really positive thing. It's like, oh, the Summer of George, like, no nefarious intent, still single in this fantasy, but for most of it, not all of it, but low responsibility, not having to work, going into the studio every day, biking every day that I can, just really being productive, working on myself, doing some writing, whatever. That was all part of the Summer of George, and those are the positive things. But sometimes the Summer of George was a little, how do we put this? Sometimes in the fantasy of Summer of George is a bit spicy. George gets around. So those things, though, are not healthy to indulge. Not for me. It's not something that I can do in a healthy way. There are things that I've done in my life that definitely weren't great for my relationships, and they weren't great for me, myself. Wasn't a good thing. And so I had to lay those things to rest and move on. But that is one reason why I am putting the fantasy of the Summer of George away. I think that it is attainable. But the Summer of George is so clearly defined. And what I mean by attainable is I think it is possible to do it and still feel fulfilled by it. Because one of the problems is sometimes my drug of choice, to borrow a phrase from Sage Francis, who is the best rapper of all time. Look it up. Look up the album Human, The Death Dance. It's freaking amazing. Anyway, to borrow a line, my drug of choice is more. More and more and more. And I have to stop myself before I just start, his whole spoken word poem there. But anyway, sometimes my drug of choice is more. I have a problem with excess. Very Dorian Gray-like of me at times. And if I had the Summer of George, one of the problems is that I would want more and more and more, and I wouldn't want it to stop. I don't think I could just say, hey, this was a great summer. It was good, positive, healthy, and I got to do all this fun stuff and just like explore and adventure and experiment and learn and grow and make some mistakes along the way and learn and grow from those. And okay, well, August is wrapping up and it's time to put the Summer of George away and move on, go to work and continue learning and growing in a different way, and just accept the fact that you don't have the same mobility, flexibility, freedom that you did during the summer. And that's okay. And I think that's really hard for me to do. I think I've had, here's the other thing. The Summer of George, I think, is attainable. Is every day going to be perfect? No, but in my fantasy it is. But that is perspective. That has to do with me and my attitude, right? So I think there is a way. Not every day is going to be perfect, but I think there's a way to have every day still be great and still have every day be the Summer of George. But I was thinking about that's why I started this conversation, is like, I have days of George. This is the Friday of George, the Sunday of George. I might have the Sunday of George right now. And I think that's a better way to look at it, because I have enough days of George. I could have a year of George, but it's hard to call it that. I think that having a Sunday of George is healthier and different than trying to say I have a week of George. Again, for me, George is the Summer of George, and that concept is so clearly defined. And part of that is not having responsibility to anyone but yourself, which is a huge fantasy of mine because I'm selfish and I'm very, very focused on myself. And I think that there's a healthy way to do that. And I like to think that I'm more on that side of the spectrum than an incredibly unhealthy way, but I definitely dip into that side too. And I think what I'm saying is that I want to work on me, and I want to learn and grow and focus on my areas of weakness and concentrate on myself. However, with that, sometimes you lose sight of the fact that part of yourself or myself is how I operate in the world and interact with other people. And that needs to be worked on too, a lot. So anyway, having a Sunday of George could be something. I think that's something I'm refocusing or recalibrating what the Summer of George means. And that, truthfully, I think the Summer of George also stems from this fantasy I have that also a friend of mine, another creative fellow artist, a good friend of mine. We've talked about it before, of just like this fantasy of like, man, what if you just like had this old school like artist relationship with yourself and operated in the way of like, you're the painter, you're an elevated person, and you just have muses, and you just, you're not in a committed relationship, and you just live and breathe art, and that's all you do, and you are just beholden to yourself, and like, oh man, that's the life, like that is it. But I know that I hold that up higher when I'm having trouble in a relationship. And why do I keep getting into relationships, romantic relationships, committed relationships? Because I know that end of the spectrum will make me happier. I like being in a monogamous, committed, long-term, focused relationship. I get a lot of value out of that. I love love. And there's a fantasy of, here's the problem, is that, man, we're going deep into the woods here, but that I guess that my heart and brain and mind and all this other emotions sometimes confuse sex and love. So they're part of that artist fantasy, that old school artist fantasy, is that I really romanticize that, partially because I want to have these very poetic, lovely, romantic experiences with people and have different partners or whatever in that scenario. But the problem is that that's not how it works for me, because I develop feelings and emotions that make me want to revisit those people and explore and have more experiences with them. And, to just part with someone, I mean, it's a fantasy to just have like a one-night stand or something and part with that person on just a lovely note. But the amount of times that I have tried that are gross, and the amount of times it's worked is like never. So part of that is just that knowledge that I know that fantasy isn't very realistic for my emotional and mental health, and that I know that I value having, again, monogamous, long-term, committed relationships a lot. And you can't have both. At least I can't. I can't get what I need from a partner on a short-term basis to really feel fulfilled. And for some people, that just makes automatic sense, but it's something I've wrestled with a lot. Anyway, back to the summer of George, and now what I will call the Sunday of George. I think that the summer of George has to be a dead idea to me, because that only works if I am single, and that's not what I want to be. But if I happen to ever be single, that idea crops up, because also I don't want to label myself as codependent, but the thing is, I like having a partner. And so I have a very hard time taking a break. I'm a serial dater, as they used to call it. And I don't have it in me in a healthy way to just chill and be by myself, focus on me in that way, get right before I enter another relationship of any kind. And that's something that, friends have told me for a long time. And I admit that, and I know that very well about myself. And I don't know, it's just really, really difficult for me to do, because I have used the comfort of another as a coping mechanism, positive and negative, and in between. So I understand why that's difficult for me, and it's hard to even want. The problem is I don't even want to work on it, because I see the value that can be had in it, but it is so ridiculously hard for me that I also just like, yeah, but what's wrong with wanting to, I don't know, to borrow another Seinfeld reference. You got Kramer, here's to feeling good all the time. Why not? It's kind of a character within a character in a very meta reference, but yeah, here's to feeling good all the time. Why not? If you can handle it, and I can't handle it, but I keep trying, and that's dumb. So anyway, closing this up, putting it to rest. The Summer of George, I think, is unattainable because it's not really what I want. I think that there's times where I definitely want that because in my everyday life, there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of chaos. And if I could just have the freedom to determine my own kind of chaos, or whatever you want to call it, it is not like everything has to be planned and organized. Part of that is the fantasy, I guess, that I have to structure myself a lot in order to be in a healthy place, in a good place and a positive space and be productive. I have to do a lot of that for my mental health. But the fantasy is like, what if I didn't have to have a traditional job? What if I didn't have responsibilities to other people than myself? I could just fly more by the seat of my pants. But a lot of people fly by the seat of their pants and live in chaos when they do have those responsibilities, and that just blows my mind. But yeah, if I can just fly by my own schedule and just paint until 4 a.m. if I feel like it, and then whatever, not have to worry about appointments and deadlines and other folks and payrolls and losing a job and whatever, like, that's real freedom. That's amazing. Like, who wouldn't want something like that, you know? Anyway, the Summer of George is dead, but through something I will discuss more in time, I think through the use of cannabis, maybe the Sunday of George has been born.